Thank you, Ajay, for gracing the occasion of your presence. Welcome back to this first session in the afternoon after lunch. And we are gathered here to discuss this book, The Politics of Virtue, Post-liberalism and the Human Future, by John Milbank and Adrian Pabst. This was published in, I think, August this year. And we are fortunate to have one of the authors here with us, Dr. Adrian Pabst, who is from the University of Kent and whose area of expertise straddles political theory, political economy, and international relations. He's also the author of many other works, including Metaphysics, the Creation of Hierarchy, and more recently, Blue Labor, Forging a New Politics. So I think we have both the written text and one of the authors here, so it's going to be an expansive situation for the interpretation of meaning. We also have with us Professor Gurpreet Mahajan from the Center for Political Studies. Professor Mahajan is a well-known political theorist, and her work on individual rights and on multiculturalism is very widely referred to. So we are fortunate in having, a wonderful discussant for this particular book. Adrian spoke to us yesterday when he was presenting his paper, and some of what he said tangentially refers to the book, but we haven't had a proper introduction to the book, so I'm going to begin by inviting him to spend about 10 minutes talking about the arguments of the book, after which the discussant will have her say, and then...
Is it the final say or...
All right. I don't know whether there are any final says, so... But I'm looking forward to engaged discussion. So please.
Thank you very much, Shefali, for your very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming here for this session. It's really a great honor to be asked to talk about the book and for the book to be featured here. So I'm very, very grateful to AJ, all his colleagues, for facilitating that, and to you for participating in the debate we're going to have. I mean, the book is very much not the final word on anything, not on liberalism, not on alternatives to liberalism. It's really trying to intervene in a debate that's been going on for some time now about the nature of liberalism, about the plausible and constructive alternatives that might be available to us. And really the starting point for the book is very much the question of what makes us human. What is it that makes us human beings in very different cultural and other contexts? And I suppose the argument we're trying to make is that there is something ultimately problematic in the way that the liberal tradition as a whole, despite all its diversity and all the nuances, there's something problematic in the way that the liberal tradition tries to conceptualize our humanity. Because the argument we're trying to make is that liberalism has a rather reductive view, and ultimately a view of humanity that may be self-defeating, that may even end up in a situation where liberalism undermines our very humanity, not through any bad intention, but essentially as, if you like, an unintended consequence of what liberal ideas and liberal institutions amount to. And so we essentially, make this argument by saying that liberalism starts with the idea that there's either this kind of violent state of nature, as I alluded to yesterday, or there's a kind of original human freedom, but either way there's a deep anthropological pessimism about what the individual or human society really mean. So either in Machiavelli and Hobbes there's this view that the individual left to his own devices will be selfish, greedy, distrustful of others and prone to violence, and therefore we need a social contract to regulate that. Or else in Rousseau, there's this idea that human society corrupts us and so we need a social contract to guard against that. Either way there's this pessimism. And there's also a kind of ontological problem with liberalism, because ontologically speaking, liberalism essentially posits the primacy of the will over the intellect, which we may want to describe philosophically speaking as voluntarism. And liberalism also rests on the idea that universals are not really in things, they're just mental concepts that we effectively project onto things. So liberalism is nominalist. And if you take together anthropological pessimism and then voluntarism and nominalism, you get something that's, at least conceptually speaking, very, very problematic, because ultimately it suggests that the individual really is primary over all forms of human association, but because the individual can't be trusted, or because the individual can never really sort of determine life in society as a whole, there needs to be another structure that can do so, and that is ultimately some form of collective power, which in the course of history have effectively become the modern sovereign state. So there's a kind of dialectical oscillation between the sovereign individual, the bearer of rights, as Locke said, the idea that we are self-proprietary animals, we are animals that own each other, and that is kind of the greatest difference between us and other living beings. But of course, for that to be a reality, for that to be upheld, we need some kind of power. And that is ultimately the collective power of the state, because only the state can guarantee those rights which we have by nature. So liberalism oscillates between, if you like, a certain form of individualism. I'm talking here ontologically speaking, not sociologically speaking. I don't want to reduce this to consumerism or anything like this. I think these are all epiphenomena. And the kind of collectivism, the kind of sovereign power of the central state. And what basically gets missed out are two things. One is the intermediary institutions that mediate between the individual on the one hand and the state on the other, but also forms of association that transcend the borders or the remit of the national sovereign state. So forms of association that actually are cross-border, they very often are cross-cultural, they very often are even across different languages. And here, of course, I have in mind all sorts of associations, from religious networks to professional links to other ties cross-border as well. So that's the, if you like, the fundamental premise, that liberalism is conceptually very problematic, but also in its concrete manifestation, has led to all sorts of problems as well. And so what we do in the books, we try and say, for politics, for the economy, for culture, education, and for international relations, there are some real alternatives to liberalism. Now, what's very important to realize is that we're not advocating in any way a form of anti-liberalism, not philosophically and not politically or otherwise. Because what we're not suggesting to do is to in any way undo the achievement of liberalism, of which there are many, and which we do acknowledge. So there are certain freedoms and opportunities that we do owe to liberal institutions. There are certain forms of emancipation, certain forms of liberation that we clearly owe to the liberal tradition. So it's by no means dismissing its historical contribution. But we do also make the point that certain ideas or practices or institutions that we ascribe to liberalism didn't necessarily originate with liberalism, and certainly no liberalism, no political or economic or any other liberalism, has any monopoly over those principles or institutions. So for instance, take freedom of speech, or take fair detention, or fair trial, or habeas corpus, or all sorts of achievements that we would naturally ascribe to liberalism. Well, the fact is that liberalism inherited these from other traditions that long preceded. Now, you might say that about any tradition. No tradition is really ever self-founding. It always inherits something from something that came before. But that's also true for liberalism. And so liberalism really has no monopoly of these things. It's made a contribution to them. It's provided us with institutions that have given reality to some of these principles. But it doesn't mean that liberalism is the only option. It certainly isn't the end of history. where we are all converging towards a final form of human government. But nor are we, if the end of history isn't true, are we necessarily heading for a clash of civilizations, because as we also say clearly in the book, most conflicts of a cultural, civilizational nature doesn't happen between civilizations but within them. You know, I mean, that's true for Christianity if you think of the endless bloodshed between Protestants and Catholics. It's true of Islam if you think of the sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia. And it's true of all sorts of other conflicts which tend to happen within very broad civilizations or cultures. Never mind what else is flawed about Huntington's thesis. And really, in the end, what we are arguing in the book is that the main opposition today is not so much between left and right, between civilizations or any other dichotomy that's been popular. Rather, the main opposition seems to be between either a form of moralism, where, there's a conceit that only liberals in this case have the answer, that only the liberal model of democracy is the only valid one, that, that model alongside with the liberal economy should be, hegemonic and so on the one hand, and the total amoralism on the other hand. The idea that you can do politics, or you can have a society or culture, education, relations, without any kind of ethics whatsoever. Right? So it's really that kind of opposition between a moralism and an amoral realpolitik, if you like, that we think is the more fundamental opposition. And again, we are not reduced to those two options. What we're arguing for is a politics of virtue, which is not moralism, which is not telling people how to behave, but is rather a recognition that virtue comes more naturally to people, comes more naturally to human cultures and societies than either a kind of amoral, abstract realpolitik or, a set of, rather arbitrary values. Because virtue already refuses a binary between theory and practice, because virtue combines principles with practice. Right? Courage is, as Aristotle argued long ago, a very good example. Courage is something which, in some sense, comes naturally to people, not to everyone in the same way, but it is part of what it is to be human. And courage is a very good illustration of what virtue is. Virtue is always a radical middle between two extremes. Either a lack of virtue, which would then be a form of cowardice, or an excess of courage, which would be recklessness. So virtue tells us already two things. A, as I said, there's no binary between theory and practice, and B, it's a radical middle between two extremes. And we then try and apply that sort of thinking, the idea that virtue comes naturally to human culture and societies, and virtue is this radical middle ground. We apply this to politics, the economy, culture, education, and international relations. And I'll just say something very, very briefly on each, really, just in the last 2 minutes. When it comes to politics, what we're trying to say in the book is that liberal democracy, again, despite all its achievements, is really running into the ground because it's, sliding into a form of democratic despotism that can be very, very dangerous. It can easily slide into anarchy, it can easily slide into demagogy, it can easily slide into even a form of tyranny, be the tyranny of the majority of the minority, as we've seen long in the past, or else even a form of tyranny of the minority over the majority. In either way, it's just unbalanced. So what we're doing in the book is arguing for much more a mixed constitution where you have an interplay of the one, the few, and the many. So, if you like, the ruler, the people, but also forms of wise guidance, of wise counsel that we, could associate with an aristocracy. Not an aristocracy of privilege, not an hereditary aristocracy, but rather an aristocracy of ethos and excellence. So leaders in each area. And that's something which is the only answer really to a completely corrupt oligarchy, which we're seeing worldwide in different contexts. So if you don't like oligarchy, I'm with you, but the alternative to oligarchy is not just to have enlightened rulers or enlightened people, you also need forms of leadership that can mediate between the two. Okay? And then the same goes for the economy. The economy can't just be an economy that's either dominated by the state or the market, where you have pure privatization, pure nationalization. It's really all of the institutions in between that matter. It's all the kind of companies that are either family-owned or owned by their employees, or in some way where people can participate. And what we also say about the economy is that you need to transform businesses from within. It's neither going to be through deregulation or through re-regulation that you're going to have a better economy. You're going to have a better economy by basically having virtuous behavior on the part of business leaders and their whole corporations. So you need to change the internal ethos if you really want to transform the market. It's no good pretending that you can either nationalize the whole market or that you can regulate it, because regulation is always a step behind, it's always external, and it rarely really achieves its purpose. Very briefly on culture and education and international relations, 30 seconds each. On culture, we basically said it's about formation of character. It can't just be the transmission of transferable skills or abstract knowledge. It has to be a formation of character. It has to be an encouragement of virtuous behavior, and not just instrumental knowledge or abstract values, which very often lack much meaning because they don't really talk about the relationship. Virtue is already embedded in cultures, it's already embedded in relationships, and that is again a difference with abstract liberal values. And finally, on international relations, we're saying that the whole Westphalian settlement is also problematic because you either see a kind of liberal triumphalism, as we've seen since the end of the Cold War, Western countries lecturing others on democracy and human rights while not always respecting them at home or abroad, or else you see a kind of slide into autocracy, into authoritarianism and other such phenomena. State capitalism, as we see in countries like Russia, and also, I suppose, still dominantly in China. And so the question is, what will be an alternative? And we basically say they need much more a notion of associations of nations and peoples around cultural identity, around social relations. You need a sense in which people share risks and rewards and resources with each other, and that is almost like a covenant. I mean, even if you're not religious, the idea that you can just contract with other individuals or other nations is simply too abstract. Not everything can be done by treaties or by formal agreements. We need to kind of encourage ways in which interpersonal relations, again, matter much more in trade and in politics and so on. And it's a very difficult thing, because interpersonal relations can be oppressive, they can be exploitative, and we know all of that. But there's no alternative to the personal. The alternative to the impersonal is the anonymous. And when you face anonymous forces, you're more likely to be dominated by exploitation and oppression than if you try and encourage something virtuous in the interpersonal. So that's really what the argument is about, is what makes us human, and whether the impersonal forces of state and market can do so, and if not, what could be the alternative to that. But I should leave it here. I'm well over my 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. And now I'm very Thank you. This is, as you can see, an unusual session, because this is not meant to be a kind of book launch where we can actually just make a few summary statements and congratulate everybody for a job well done. This is part of a session in a seminar, and I think the only way to do justice to it is really to take the ideas seriously, to have an intense engagement and debate, and articulate elements that one can agree with and discontent that we might possibly have, and why. So I see my job as that, and to the chair I would only say that I have a difficult and perhaps the exceptional job, because everybody presented their ideas. I had to read a book of which has about 400 pages, and in all honesty I must say, since it is online, available to me electronically, I did not read all 400 pages, but I have read well over half. I have not read sections on economy, seriously. I just looked at few statements here and there. But since I have this job of having actually to speak about Adrian, I'm only talking about Adrian as one of the authors, but since he's here, he's my reference point all the time. Their text, I think I would exercise some, I don't know, laxity, give myself some privilege of rambling on a little bit more. Although I have not read the full book, I think the book has an argumentative coherence and a central argument which runs through at least
introduction, the first 2 chapters, the last one, and sections here and there. So there is an argumentative coherence. So even if I have not read that, I thought I could take the liberty of talking about those essential ideas. I'm glad also that Adrian has presented to us the background from which he's coming, the ideas they are concerned with, because there has been for some time, at least for more than 2 decades, maybe 3 decades at least, very sharp engagement with and discussion about liberalism and the kind of society it has yielded. Discussions have happened and debates have been there from, you mentioned communitarians, and you say you are not a communitarian, which is good to know, Aristotelians, Straussians, and so on and so forth, and you can see a bit of everything there. So what is new and different? And I think there Adrian stopped too early, in my view. And living in this post-structuralist world, readers can have a little bit of say in these matters, saying that this is the way the book looked to me. I think the book makes 2 or 3 very sharp statements, which I'm going to use as the peg that we need to talk about and discuss. The first is, it notes and begins with introducing us to the idea that there is, and we are today living in a world which is facing a meta-crisis, quote-unquote, meta-crisis. It's a crisis that we see visible to us in the political domain, in the economic domain, and in the ethical domain. In all spheres of life, we are facing a crisis. Some of which have been talked about. Economic, everybody knows since the collapse that occurred, the economic crisis that triggered off with the, I don't know, Lehman Brothers or whoever it was, and the crash that followed after that. 2, the fact that which had been talked about in his paper yesterday too, in David's, that the liberal state is founded on, that the idea of a collective will always imply either violence or complete indifference. And that's the basis of a crisis, that it doesn't live up to what it says it will. But most of all, and that is the undercurrent, it has yielded a society of human beings who are completely atomized, self-seeking, egoistic, I was going to say lusting for something, material gain, greed, false pride, I'm using the word false before pride, like vainglory, that sort of thing, and only concerned perhaps at the most with security. And this obviously shows that we have a society which is not very sociable. There is lack of trust. People are in that sense alone, the notions of alienation come to mind. And in every way, life is not just miserable, it has undermined civic bonds. So we are in a deep, deep crisis. And the second point really is, this deep crisis lies at the door of liberalism. It is liberalism and its thinking that is responsible for our state of meta-crisis that the world is in today. And we need really now to look for a way forward and out of it. At one level, it is making a simple argument that it has created a society which is lacking in everything we value, such values as trust, reciprocity, love, friendship, human association, everything that we would regard necessary for our human lives and regard to be important. But at a stronger level, it is saying that, look, we need to look for an alternative, which they refer to as post-liberal politics of virtue. And it has some very attractive elements in it, such as that seeks to, and I quote him, fuse greater economic justice with social reciprocity. Even Marx could not have put it so nicely. A world where personal requirements are met, each contributes to the whole, does his or her job well, and so this is, a kind of utopia. But how are we going to arrive at that post-liberal politics of virtue? And there, I think there are 2 kinds of arguments that are there. One, of course, detailing to us what is required to move in that direction. For instance, we are told we need to question the basic liberal and secular habits of the mind, because these are linked to the ideas of negative freedom which he spoke about yesterday, and they cannot really be the basis of reciprocity. On the positive side, we need a sense of collectiveness, see ourselves as a collective, to aim at some shared good and have some idea of how to achieve it and pursue it. And even more substantially than that, we need really to inculcate a social existence which is based on reciprocal giving, of which friendship and gift giving is, in some sense, the idea of gift is very central here. And so these are all ways of moving away from procedural justice and instrumental reason. So we need really to explore an avenue of positive freedom. And what is that positive freedom? And that's very important. That's the second part of, I think, their argument. That we need really to locate our society in the search for an objective truth and a substantive good. This substantive good and objective truth should attract us due to its own inherent rightness. So some kind of truth of this kind is what we are going to look for. And where are we going to get it? And how do we going to pursue this element? Well, this is going to be pursued, and they use the term politics of soul sometimes instead of politics of virtue, to say that this can be assured by the existence within a polity of a trans-political, quote-unquote, trans-political community oriented beyond time to eternity and devoted to more rigorous ideals than the community at large to guide us. Ultimately, the reference, at least to my mind, is to an ideal of a substantive good which perhaps life in religion offers as a trans-political community. And there is a reference here to the Buddhist Sangha, to the idea of Ummah in Islam, and to the Hinduist tradition of placing the Guru even above the king. So there are passing references which reinforce to me the idea that this imagination of a trans-political community anchored in some notion of objective truth which it has given to itself or has arrived at, or it has been, I don't know, revealed to it by the wise men or the Son of God or somebody. This political community, answerable to the spiritual, whose higher standard is much reinforced by the presence of, and he has mentioned it, spiritual virtuosity and ascetic sub-corporations. So we are really looking for some form of trans-political, trans-territorial really anchoring for this, and which is really guiding, giving us a conception of good and guiding and becoming the basis of collective life in this particular society. Of course, this substantive good will be anchored in such notions as practices of honor and reciprocity, but the terms are very important. There is wisdom earlier, now there is honor, and of course to combine. And this is something, such an ethos can only develop over time through formation of tradition. The educated exercise of, quote unquote, this is all quote, wise leadership and prudential adoption in practice by all of previous example. So we will have a primacy of common good, we will have a culture of honor, we will have a community based on virtue with gift, true socialism, those are the words they use, political pluralism, genuine corporatism, etc., etc. And towards the end, when they are talking about mixed constitutions, there is, as it were, at the center of it, the pride of place to constitutional monarchy. Because they, as it were, offer the quote-unquote gift of God, being able, like you, to stand alone and yet be answerable to that divine law and the law within. So this is the kind of way in which we are going to realize the alternative. This is the kind of alternative we are looking for. It seems, and they refer to it as a politics of hope, as opposed to politics of fear and exclusion. And this is not to be confused, as they rightly say, with communitarianism, which attacks only aspects, some aspects of liberalism, or with neo-Nazism. This is not meant to be equated with either of those things. This is different. This is located in some notion of substantive good, which we are going to get from this ethical community, which perhaps a trans-political, trans-territorial unity like, I don't know, I was going to say religion vaguely, but I should now be more precise and say, because in the book the motives are is overwhelmingly Christian, that it is actually calling an abstract notion of substantial good anchored in the Christian way of imagining the good, that might well be an anchor for looking and pushing this forward. And the book ends by making a statement like this: Christian churches need to organize and act directly in the economy, culture, education and politics fields, and not through surrogates like political parties, etc. The one which you can sort of, which I need to say nevertheless. You know, post-Brexit world, one thing became very clear, that we need really to be cognizant. I don't think we need to put full weight on our subject position, but we need to be cognizant of the subject position because the world looks different. In England, it looked different to those who were in the metropolis and those who were outside of the metropolis. And I think this is important. And this might well also be true of the way liberalism looks to us in different subject positions, both in that world as well as when you move from the West to countries like India. And Professor Gopal Guru is here, and he mentioned that we need perhaps also to look at the historical role that liberalism has played. And it is true, as Adrian mentioned, they don't want to dismiss it entirely. They do recognize that liberalism did provide for freedoms and autonomy. But this is mentioned in about, I don't want to count the number of sentences, but really it has not been the subject of serious consideration. No, I'm taking more. Just simply that. I've read 200 pages on my own views. I can give in 10 minutes, no problem.
Gurpreet,
I have to do justice
remember,
to his book.
we are talking about liberalism.
Yes.
This is post-liberalism. She doesn't accept the idea of...
No, I said this is an exceptional session. Otherwise, if I were presenting my ideas, I'd do it in 15 and 10. But I have to take your ideas seriously first, and then try and say what I want to say about them. Okay, not counting this time in the floor. Okay, so there is this element. How do we take it seriously? And I think one has to look at the case of women, at the case, and in India, of marginalized groups, of various lower castes, really to see. And it can't be just dismissed in a sentence in saying that they have contributed to freedom. We need really to understand what kind of difference. Because after all, liberalism was also interested in transcendence. Transcendence of that which seemed to be near natural and culturally natural, of the way things were ordered in society, in community at a given moment in time. We need also to recognize that there is a difference, because you do make statements that what we need in the new order really is to think in terms of re-evaluating work, reassessing the different kinds of work that people are doing. But surely, and that's what liberalism is important for, to recognize that it is not only re-evaluation of jobs that is needed, but the fact that the same people, why should the women not only their work be re-evaluated and reassessed as positive contribution? Why should they not also be performing other jobs as entrepreneurs, as CEOs, etc., etc.? And I think that's the first thing, that we need to take these elements of liberalism very seriously and say how we are going to integrate them in the present post-liberal world. And we need to recognize the ongoing contribution that that makes. The second point, and that's to me very, very important. You know, Christianity, we are told, and I'm sure this is the case, offers a model of human association, and you mentioned agape, love of various kinds, and not getting into that idea at all. The issue really is that can we speak about religion merely in terms of an abstract idea, devoid of its core theological content and lived historical practices through which the religion is lived? And if we do that, then we need to problematize what notion of human association and love is part of this understanding. Because we have to bring in notions of sin, of guilt, of the kinds of things that are listed as sin which needed to be overcome, which liberalism did challenge substantially and continues to be an important force to challenge. So we need really, hiding and talking about just agape or friendship or human association, transcending the individual, I think is too abstract and hides the substantive nature and vision of the everyday in that human association. Thirdly, we might also want to consider what kind of notion of human association is really implicit in this. And the one that comes to mind, that of course suffer for and with others, and suffer for others of course is important. And there used to be this element that you need to think in terms of dying with dignity. But sometimes I think we need to ask, what would life with dignity imply, merely rather than merely that final moment of death that we are talking about. The next point that I want to really focus on is, when we are thinking in terms of friendship as being the model of this human association, I think friendship is very desirable. But friendship requires determinate relationships between determinate people. When friendship is becoming a mode of existence where you love the world in general, actually it is not a mode of friendship at all. It is an extremely, in fact, it is so dissipated that it loses everything that makes it really, really worthwhile. In fact, it might end up being very, very oppressive, because you're forced, 1 minute, we are forced to be, I'm going to leave some of those points aside and come back to them, a little while later. There is, of course, and I can't conclude without bringing in this element of rule by wise men in a framework of constitutional monarchy, or the role that wisdom plays, which is necessary for our existence. It is true that liberalism does not pay sufficient attention to many things that we desire in individual life. But we need also perhaps to question why, what kind of historical experience has been yielded when quote-unquote wise men have ruled, when there was a close affinity, when the spiritual dominated the political for so many centuries. And surely, was that to be treated as an aberration? If such aberrations that can occur, then what kind of safeguard do we have? So finally, my point really is that there may be something missing and wanting in terms of layers that liberalism has left us with. But I think we do need to recognize that liberalism also, like science, is continuously facing these challenges and trying to reinvent itself. And I would plead also with David that perhaps I think efforts by people like Immanuel Kant were efforts in that direction. There were efforts really to move away from a utilitarian logic, to think in terms of ways in which we could forge a moment of coming together, build solidarities on the basis of respect for each other, without necessarily appealing directly to the wisdom of few who have access to the spiritual and the objective truth.
Thank you. Well, I think that the one author we have here, he has a lot to respond to. But before I throw it open to the House, I'd just like to add just one point. I have just one query. And I'm going to focus on the chapters on culture. I'm a little puzzled about the following. One thing that perhaps came across, or maybe not, so I'll just repeat it, that one argument that is made in this book is that there isn't really much of a gap between the right-wing liberals and the left liberals. Because whereas in the realm of the economy, the right liberals ask for the removal of all kinds of restrictions on economic behavior. Similarly, in the realm of culture, left liberals ask for removing of all restrictions. So in that sense, they are united in that respect. Now, to this, I think this book tries to build up this contrast of virtue ethics, and that's an important idea, I think, the idea of the good, and the idea of the good as something that is internal to a social practice, and not something as, dependent on what you or I personally think to be the good. But my worry was that in the section on culture, the writers, when they present this contrast, then it seems to be that, for example, since Professor Mahajan has already talked about gender, I won't, but there is also another example given about forms of sexual expression. And there it seems to me as if, Adrian, that the book is presenting it, the contrast in this following manner, that when an attempt is made to transform existing practices of sexuality, then that transformative attempt is seen as a form of self-expression. Whereas when there is a discussion of the practice that is sought to be transformed, right? So for example, when heterosexuality is questioned in the name of bisexuality or transgender, then the practice that is sought to be transformed is assumed to have a good internal to itself. And the attempt at change then becomes just a mode of self-expression. So I thought that that was, just putting too much weight on building your argument like that. There are several other questions that can be raised, of course, and I think some of those questions have to do with the fact, what about our context, the post-colonial context, where the problem with liberalism, I think, is its exclusions, or for many of us, that is its main problems. The claim to universal rights is met actually with exceptions all around. So what does the politics of virtue have to tell us as to how to deal with these exclusions? But anyway, I'll leave my questions for later, and I think we can take a few questions and then ask Adrian to respond.
Very illuminating all around. I'm just going to touch on a couple things. So the one thing that I found, that I didn't quite understand, I suppose, is why the focus. And I guess you already addressed this issue, but why the focus is on a politics of virtue rather than a particular form of virtue? Because you're emphasizing the way in which this type of politics of virtue has to come out of a concrete tradition. Yet when you express it as virtue itself, courage as something that's generally human, you're actually then taking it out of a specific tradition, which then seems to be a sort of a self-contradiction almost. And in fact, I guess I would welcome it much more if it were, in fact, yes, a concept of Christian virtue, for instance, where you're saying, yes, there's this particular tradition of virtue that we would like to put forward as a basis of a kind of universal mediator of culture and politics, right? So that was the one thing, but I guess that goes toward this other issue that I already brought up in my contribution yesterday, but maybe I would like to kind of reformulate it now, just in terms of your argument, that liberalism itself is a tradition, and as a tradition, it does actually have a kind of, some substantive notions. It's not just a negative ideology, I suppose. Because my sense is you're presenting it as just about the sort of negative liberty of self-preservation, but there's a part of liberal theory that makes that argument, but that's not when you look at the entire tradition of it. It actually develops a kind of positive notion of virtue. That includes, things like, tolerance, I suppose, but also a kind of respect for the desire of all people to want to to express themselves, to realize themselves in a sense, right? So there are some, that are, I guess, specific liberal virtues, and that there's a sort of specific tradition of that, and in a way, that liberal tradition has certainly eclipsed the Christian tradition of a kind of universal politics, and I don't see why we need to reject that in order to somehow jump back toward another tradition. Especially if it were a Christian one, it would be such a kind of a jarring kind of leap that in fact doesn't do justice to the tradition up to this point. And then finally, I think one of the things that's really positive about liberalism at this point, sort of in the world today, and especially in, I guess, particularly in the United States and Europe, where there's this questioning of liberal values, is the way in which liberalism has been very successful in trying to mediate between different conceptions of the good, right? And so, certainly in the United States, I mean, one of the really positive things about liberalism there is that it's really been able to serve as a kind of umbrella for all sorts of sort of substantive conceptions of the good expressed through religious communities, through different types of communities in the United States that are able to coexist with each other without conflict. I mean, it's really very unique in the United States, and it's certainly something, I guess, in Europe, which is also, in a sense, working in the, despite all the problems of the European Union, a kind of overall liberal umbrella is able to mediate between the individual, ethnic, national groups, religious groups, in a way that grants each one its ability to define the good and organize human relationships in terms of some conception of the good, but isn't going to impose a particular, or allow a particular one of those conceptions to sort of impose itself on the other. And so that liberalism is kind of serving as a kind of umbrella type of, framework within which we can place that orientation toward virtue and the good as a kind of mid-place. Basically, what you were demanding, in a sense, of placing that type of politics of virtue as a kind of middle ground between the individual and a kind of overall liberal superstructure. So that in that sense, I mean, I think liberalism is really functioning as that kind of, I hesitate to use the word imperial, but it is kind of imperial in the sense that it's an overarching system, it's also a very specific tradition, and it's also trying to mediate between individual communities within the sort of imperial system. So anyway, great presentation all around. And so those are the thoughts that came to my mind.
Thank you very much. It has been really a productive session in many senses. This is a question which follows what Shefali, where you ended, the question of colonialism. Because, when we talk about the genesis of liberalism, we tend to elide the question of colonialism. And that was one question which was the central figure in studies like Uday Mehta's on liberalism. That is, the very making of the liberal virtue for a sect of people. That was taking place at a time when liberalism was utterly complicit with colonial expansion and denial of all kinds of rights to people. Now, this actually comes back to the question that David raised, especially, that there's an element of imperialism in liberalism. And, the arrogance of considering Christianity as the kind of virtuous epicenter of some kind of religiosity, and that can be transported in other traditions of ideas and thoughts and practices. I mean, that element of arrogance actually that accompanies the very idea of imperialism. Now, I was trying to think, why is it that liberalism is facing this crisis now? Is it completely unrelated to its history of colonialism? Probably not. Because the kind of arguments that come from, Michael Moore's film actually talks about it at length. For instance, Trump is popular because Trump says, gives the kind of arguments to the American white working class, which are akin to the drain of wealth theory that colonialism talked about. The colonized talked about vis-a-vis the colonial power. And for instance, Trump says that our factories, manufacturing units are going to Mexico. We thought similar things about our manufacturing capabilities being exported to England. There is something which is coming back to haunt liberalism. And what is coming back from the ghosts of its colonial past.
Yep.
So maybe we should get some responses from Dr. Pabst, and then we can take other questions.
Okay, sure. Do you want to stand or sit?
As you wish, whatever it is.
Well, I'm happy to.
Let me stay here. Thank you. Yes. Well, first of all, can I say how grateful I am for all of your comments. Obviously, starting with Gurpreet, but also Shefali and everyone who's made some comments. Because, as I said at the beginning, this is not at all intended to be any sort of final word on anything, and really part of a much wider and longer debate that I think will carry on for some time, because these issues, I think, have not been in any way resolved, and as a number of people have said, I think they will stay with us for the foreseeable future. Can I maybe answer them in reverse order? Is that okay? Only because that will enable me to tie a few things together. I think that's absolutely right. There is something imperial about liberalism. Now, that might have its good features, perhaps. I'm less certain. I'm now becoming the radical skeptic when I hear this. But I agree that there is a very strong colonial element to it. And let's not forget, in the very specific case of the British Empire, this was driven by a Whig ideology. That was a profoundly liberal ideology, over against a Tory vision. Now, I'm not saying the Tory vision was perfect, or is perfect, or will be perfect, but there's a very clear difference. And I think it's no accident that the British Empire was driven by a Whig ideology, also linked to a certain form of Protestantism, not by a high Tory vision. So I think that is very clearly something very fundamental. And I think you're quite right. That is now coming back to haunt liberalism, because we know that imperialism at some point will face, what the CIA calls blowback. It will lead up to all sorts of consequences that will then, as you say, come back to haunt its masters. And it's also no surprise, I think, given the colonial link going back to the 18th and 19th century, that actually when political liberalism became properly hegemonic, i.e. in the wake of World War I, with Wilsonian idealism, and then in the wake of World War II, and certainly after 1989, that it's always taken on imperial forms. And it's basically said, as Wilson said to to King George V when he came to London on Christmas Day 1918, he said to the whole court assembled there, and there was a big state banquet in his honour. He was the President of the United States. America and Britain had just, after 4 very bloody years, helped to win World War I. What did Wilson say to the court and to the king? Effectively, he said, and I'm not quoting verbatim, but the meaning of it was, your world is over, it's now our turn. It's now going to be an American form of hegemony. And that meant, of course, the imposition, for good or for ill, of certain liberal, American liberal norms. Now, yes, there is something liberating about this. Sovereignty of people, of individuals, and of nations. But I think the darker side is that it does need a hegemonic power to enforce that order. You know, that order isn't self-sustaining. You can't say to people, you are sovereign, you have a sovereign state, and things just kind of, you know, are kept in balance. You need a hegemonic power both at home and abroad to sustain that sort of liberal order. So the question is not, you know, is liberalism a liberation from hegemonic power or from domination? The question is liberal hegemony or liberal domination better than other forms of domination? That's the real question. Now, it may well be better on balance, or it may not. But I think that's the question we have to ask. Now, I'm going to come back to the point about Christianity because it's really crucial. But I would say then, going on to what David has said, and as much I agree with, but I do wonder whether liberalism is quite as benign as you say, whether it's in America or perhaps internationally. Because it seems to me that liberalism is not just acting as a disinterested, benign mediator of different ideas. I mean, liberalism is very normative, it's very hegemonic when it comes to its own standards, because it views everything, even the notion of coexistence itself, through its own liberal lenses. And that means that in the end, whatever is going to be questioning the liberal umbrella, right, the kind of overarching liberal framework, will not be tolerated. So at the very point at which liberalism says, here we are proclaiming the era of intolerance, it's profoundly intolerant vis-à-vis any ideas or any practices that question liberal universality. So in that sense, I'm sorry, there is a huge tension between liberal tolerance on the one hand and what we might call real tolerance on the other, which is, you know, where is the space in liberalism for people who don't just question individual liberal values or ideas, but question the whole of liberalism? And there isn't really. I mean, there is no one who's going to be successful in American politics or elsewhere saying, you know, that they're going to take on, you know, that liberal framework. It's just not going to happen. You know, so I think we have to be quite clear about that. And it actually goes back to the point about, you know, which you made about the post-colonial context. You know, the liberal claim to universality on the one hand, and the exclusion of all sorts of rights. Because as we, you know, I mean, David and I were discussing this briefly over lunch. In a liberal economy, or shall we say liberal capitalism, those who don't have economic or social value have absolutely no role whatsoever. They are the leftovers. They are the people who will be excluded because if you don't have economic or social value, frankly, you're not going to count. Right? So notions of intrinsic worth or dignity simply don't come into the equation. And liberal conceptions of dignity are very, very shallow. You know, if you look at a whole kind of the endless debates of the last, you know, 200 years now, you know, rights and dignity versus notions of the good and of virtue. Liberalism is always on the side of rights and always on the side of a certain notion of dignity, but that's really very, very superficial. It's got nothing to do with intrinsic worth. And the fact is, you know, even for someone like Locke to go on about, you know, human beings being the bearer of individual rights, but at the same time as Locke was arguing that and arguing against slavery, he was the owner of 400 slaves. I'm just saying, you know, these contradictions are pretty fundamental. They're not just at the secondary or tertiary level, they're at the primary level of what liberalism really means. David's other point about a tradition with substantive notions, well, I mean, I've just touched on tolerance. I agree that there is this idea of self-realization, but I'm not sure that, you know, the liberal model of self-realization is quite as benign, again, because I think it's a lot about will, and it's a lot about personal desire, which really doesn't take into account all the mutual reciprocal arrangements that make, you know, a society what it is. I don't really get from the liberal tradition any substantive notions of reciprocity. I don't know what that means in a liberal context to talk about reciprocity, because it's really seen as an exchange of individual goods or services, or an exchange of desires. But where's the mutuality in liberalism? Where's the liberal thinking on what binds us together, above and beyond rights and contracts? And I just don't see what that is in the liberal tradition. So there are some substantive notions, I agree, but I think ultimately they always rest on something very formal and abstract, which is individual rights, formal contracts. What I don't get in the liberal tradition is any substantive notion of the common good. Because liberalism has already decided ontologically that that common good doesn't exist, that if it existed it would have to be imposed by one, that would be, you know, intolerant and so on. So therefore really the common good for the liberal tradition is just an aggregation of individual goods. I don't see the real substantive commonality or reciprocity or mutuality in the liberal tradition. And where there are thinkers who are talking about it, like Constant, Guizot, Tocqueville in the French context, or Burke, or T.H. Green, or Hobhouse in the English-speaking context, and many others, I'm not sure we can just classify that as liberal thinking. I mean, arguably, Burke and Tocqueville, just to take the two, coming from two different contexts, were not, quintessentially liberal thinkers. They were probably just as conservative as they were liberal. So therefore, we can't really say that they are more liberal than they are conservative. Now, I don't think conservatism can claim them for itself either. But the point is they're very hybrid. And so already they're qualifying liberalism in quite significant ways. Whereas that's not true of Locke or Rousseau or Hobbes or, or others that we, I think, can legitimately think of as more central to the liberal tradition. Now, these debates will be ongoing. I don't claim this is the final word on what is part of the liberal tradition and what isn't. David's other point, the first one he made, was about, what about a specific tradition like Christianity versus general features, for instance, like virtue. I don't have long, right? That's what you're trying to say. I'm sorry. I'll try and be quicker. Sorry. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and one which I think.
I think David's had a share, so...
Okay, all right, I should move on to other comments. Okay, all right, okay. Shouldn't really hit on David all the time, it's unfair. Anyway, I've tried to... You've had your shares too, okay, fine. All right, so I'm going to go to the first 5 points. Okay.
And I missed many others.
And you missed many more, okay, so I should definitely... All right, I might actually take your...
2 minutes as part of ongoing debate.
I might take yours in the order in which you presented them. So yes, of course, you're absolutely right that liberalism is still very meaningful and significant in lots of contexts. For instance, a post-colonial context, the role of women and minorities. And that's why we very clearly say we are not in any way anti-liberal. We don't want to undo anything, and we don't say that liberalism has absolutely no role to play. You're right, we don't spend much on this in the book, but the point is other people are writing about what liberalism can do, so frankly, what are we going to add to that other people aren't already saying? We're much more saying, rather than thinking of it as liberalism or anti-liberalism, what else is there that needs to be part of this debate? So it's not about displacing liberalism or going with the anti-liberals, of which frankly there are far too many, all the reactionaries that we see now politically in their ascendancy. It's just to say that there needs to be other traditions that are part of that conversation. That's why we don't spend a long time saying what liberalism can do going forward. Because I'm not sure we have anything very original to contribute to that. But I think you're right, the liberal contribution can be significant going forward. I think also if liberalism becomes at times a bit more self-critical. And some people are doing that work, but I'm not sure necessarily there's quite enough of that. Yes, agree that liberalism challenges very important things like sin and guilt, and can be liberating because religion can be oppressive and can deny the very things it otherwise claims to offer, which is a sense of the good, a sense of sharing in it, and so on. I agree with that, but I suppose you could say that about any tradition, couldn't you? That you always have examples that need to be critiqued from within the tradition. And so I think just as much as liberalism needs to be more self-reflexive and understand where it's gone wrong, clearly that's true for all religious traditions, and Christianity first and foremost, because it makes such claims about universal validity, universal truth. And so if anything, we're also saying that, if Christianity and other world religions want to play a role going forward, a positive one, they need to obviously reflect on where they've gone wrong in the past. So that's, a big part of that. And we certainly don't claim that there's any golden age to which we should return, which is why we very explicitly refute any notion of nostalgia. We have no nostalgia for any golden age because there never was one, and there never will be a golden age. But likewise, I think there's no point in suggesting that everything in the past was really a bit bad, and until the 1960s came along, everyone was kind of oppressed in whatever way. I'm not sure that's quite accurate either, and I'm not saying that's your point, but many people would make that sort of remark, that really you have to wait until the mid-20th century for there to be kind of universal liberation. I'm not sure. I think there are examples in the past from which we can learn. Human association, I agree, it can be the opposite of freedom and emancipation and self-realization, but again, I'm not sure the liberal mode of freedom, emancipation, self-realization is the only one available to us, and I think it's got very, very dark sides. So I'm not, that's why we're not communitarians, because we don't think communities are the level at which people necessarily can find that kind of true fulfillment and mutual flourishing. But the point is also that the liberal way is perhaps not the only and certainly not the best way of trying to have better forms of human association. And you're right, friendship has its own limits, and we know that not all relationships can be envisaged or practiced in accordance with the idea of friendship. But I think friendship is something which, again, is both specific in each cultural context. I mean, friendship doesn't look exactly the same everywhere, and yet also has universal features. And I think the same is true for things like courage or love or other virtues, that, yes, of course, in every case, they are quite specific. I mean, romantic love is a certain European 18th century idea, okay? But that doesn't mean that you can then say there's no romantic love anywhere else. If by romantic love we don't just mean the 18th century account of it, but rather the idea that you have courtship, that people fall in love, and then they try and build something from there, to put it in very almost in sort of flippant terms. But the point is, universality doesn't exclude particularity and vice versa, right? And courage will have different epiphenomena, but there will be a core of courage which is sort of the same across cultures. Okay? So I don't think one necessarily excludes the other, but I agree that in the end virtue is very much a matter of cultural embeddedness. And I think we need to start with those traditions rather than start with the abstract ideal. So I agree with that. And finally, on wisdom, yes, we certainly use the term wisdom and wise men and women quite a lot in the book, and there are certainly very few examples in the past from which one could learn that don't have all sorts of problems, not least, as you said, the domination of the spiritual over the political, or indeed, which you didn't say, but I think could be understood as such, is that we have a kind of a world in mind where essentially men are in charge and women don't really play a prominent role. And of course these limitations are very real, not just sociologically speaking, but even philosophically when we look at Plato and Aristotle, and indeed Christian writers as well. But I suppose ultimately what we're trying to say is that the liberal account of knowledge is rather too limited. It's far too much focused on a narrow account of reason. It's not expansive enough. It doesn't take into account feeling or habit or indeed faith. And that therefore it kind of cuts us off from all sorts of sources, which I think are very important. And I do think that wisdom matters also because it links us to the past. It does link us to our inheritance, however problematic that inheritance might be. But we are historical beings, and we can't escape that. And if we are going to make things better going forward, we also have to learn from the past and have to know what's wrong about our inheritance, but we certainly can't do that if we completely ignore it. And I think liberalism doesn't value inheritance and wisdom enough, and therefore I think leaves us, as I said, more impoverished, and in that sense less human. It's trying to reinvent itself, you're quite right, like science, and we certainly hope that better forms of liberalism will continue to emerge. But as I said, the main argument is to say, we are not left with a choice between liberalism and anti-liberalism. There are lots of traditions, and especially a tradition of virtue and honour, a tradition of reciprocity and so on, I think has much to contribute in that debate. I should leave it there. Sorry for going on for too long.
Thank you. Thank you to both the panelists for...
If there is time, not about
Are you going to stay for, are you going to stay with
But I was going to say, in the interest of ongoing debate, just two things. I would agree that I think we do have notions of a life well lived, and things that we regard to be important when we say this is a person who has lived a good life and is a good person and so on. And we would like this to be really extended to a framework which we can think of in society and institutions. And how might that possibly be done? And surely we want these things to be done. But I'm wondering, just like David, whether the jump is too much, really, to the other side, and that we are finding it in Christianity. But at the end, the issue is this. Indifference of laws can be oppressive, and benevolent employer can be very sort of comforting at times. But at the end of the day, if I am making a choice, I'm just speaking for myself now, if I'm making a choice between benevolence and charity on the one side and claim-based rights on the other, I'm standing on the second side. And I might then have to ask why that is the case. So, but I would still think there is some merit in standing on the other side, while we need to encourage generosity, charity.
So I think we'll continue this debate over tea, and we come back at 4:10, 4:15. Thank you everybody.
Thank you.